Most people think a crash is an accident. I do not. I think a crash is an auction. That one sentence will do more for your financial life than 100 hours of television commentary ever will. Because once you understand that, the entire world of money starts to look different. You stop asking, how bad will this get? And you start asking the only question that matters, who is showing up with cash when the room goes dark? I have watched markets for a very long time. I have watched people build fortunes in booms and lose them in busts. I have watched men confuse rising prices with intelligence and falling prices with the end of civilization. I have watched ordinary investors pray for recovery, while a much smaller group prepared for markdowns. That smaller group understood something the crowd never fully accepts. Crashes do not distribute pain randomly. They transfer ownership. That is the mother line I want you to keep in your head all the way through this. A crash is not just a decline in prices. It is a transfer window. It is the moment when weak hands, borrowed hands, frightened hands, and overcommitted hands are forced to let go of things they would have preferred to keep. It is the moment when liquidity becomes a weapon. It is the moment when patience stops looking boring and starts looking predatory. In good times, the financial world teaches you a very soothing religion. Stay fully invested. Do not think too much. Diversify broadly. Ignore valuations. Ignore cycles. Ignore who is buying what and when. And for a certain class of investor, one who will never study structure, never act decisively, never accumulate enough optionality to exploit a panic, that religion works well enough. It keeps him in the game. It protects him from his own worst instincts. It is not evil advice. It is just incomplete advice. It was never written for the person who wants to understand how wealth actually migrates during a crisis. If you want to understand that, you have to stop thinking like a holder and start thinking like an acquirer. That identity shift is everything. Most people think the rich get richer in crashes because they are lucky, or because they have secret information, or because they are somehow more comfortable with risk. Some are not. The far more important truth is that they do not enter the crash with the same objective as everyone else. The average investor enters a crash hoping not to lose too much. The prepared investor enters it hoping to buy something he could not buy at that price 6 months earlier. One person is trying to survive the auction. The other is trying to win it. That is why I want to walk you through the 5 classes of assets that tend to appear again and again when serious capital prepares for turbulence. I am not asking you to copy every instrument exactly. In a few cases you cannot. The point is not imitation at the surface. The point is understanding the logic beneath it. If you grasp the logic, you can adapt it to your own world. If you miss the logic, you can memorize every ticker in the world and still fail when the pressure arrives. Let us begin with the most boring asset on the list, because boring in money is often just another word for misunderstood. Cash equivalents and short-term government paper. People laugh at it when markets are flying. They call it lazy, they call it dead money, they call it missed opportunity. I have heard those phrases my whole life, usually from people who become very humble the moment real discounts show up and they discover they have no ammunition. That is the first mechanism. I call it dry powder. Dry powder is not exciting because it is not designed to flatter your ego. It is designed to preserve your ability to act. That distinction matters more than most investors realize. If you sit in 3-month government paper while everyone else stretches for another few points of return, you will look foolish right until the moment the market hands extraordinary businesses to disciplined buyers at emergency prices. Then the foolishness turns into power. The crowd sees yield foregone. I see optionality purchased. Optionality is one of the most mispriced assets in the world because most people only understand it after they no longer have it. They do not appreciate the value of cash while valuations are rich. Credit is easy. And every conversation sounds like confidence. They appreciate it when something breaks, and they realize that every dollar they fully deployed into an overpriced market is one less dollar they can use when assets finally become cheap. That is what the wealthy understand. Cash is not just what you hold when you are scared, it is what you hold when you want to be dangerous later. If I have $10 million in short-term paper while the market is euphoric, maybe I earn less than the man who went all in on glamour. He looks brilliant. I look sleepy. Then the cycle turns. His glamour falls in half. Mine does not. Suddenly he is emotional, and I am liquid. Now we are not two investors with different opinions. We are two men standing in the same auction with radically different levels of power. That is why I have always preferred to think of liquidity, not as a comfort blanket, but as purchasing authority deferred. And here is the deeper truth. The wealthy rarely think of cash as a final destination. They think of it as the universal key. It buys anything after the markdown. It buys stocks, debt, land, contracts, fine assets, entire businesses, and sometimes influence over the terms themselves. When everybody else is fully loaded and emotionally committed, cash looks embarrassing. When everybody else becomes a forced seller, cash becomes aristocratic. Now let us move to the second mechanism, because this is where the financial system reveals one of its least understood transfer channels: distressed debt. Most people hear those words and their eyes glaze over. That is fine. Indifference is one of the reasons this mechanism remains so powerful. If ordinary investors understood how much wealth is built here, they would stop treating bankruptcy as a final chapter and start seeing it as a change of ownership paperwork. That is the second mechanism. I call it the waterfall. When a company begins failing, the equity holders are not the first people with a claim on whatever survives. They are last. Ahead of them stand layers of creditors, each with varying levels of priority. In normal times, very few retail investors care about that structure because the stock is the exciting thing it moves. It tells a story. It promises upside. But when a business is drowning, excitement is worthless. Priority is everything. That is what distressed debt buyers understand. They are not buying the dream of the business at some heroic valuation. They are buying a legal position inside the wreck. If they buy the right debt at the right discount, they are not betting on whether the old shareholders get saved. They are positioning to become the new owners after the old structure is cleared away. Think about the brilliance of that. The crowd buys the company when it is loved. The distressed buyer buys the claim when it is hated. The crowd owns the upside story. The distressed buyer owns the place in line. And in a bankruptcy, the place in line matters more than the story ever did. This is why I say crashes transfer ownership. The public believes it is watching destruction. Often it is watching substitution. Old equity is wiped. New equity is issued. The people who bought debt at pennies on the dollar emerge, holding stakes in real assets, operating businesses, property routes, contracts, or brands that were too expensive to buy through the front door during good times. That is not a gamble in the way the public imagines gambling. It is a legal acquisition system disguised as a credit trade. The average investor looks at a collapsing company and says, "That thing is toxic." The skilled distressed buyer asks, at what price does the toxic headline stop mattering because the assets underneath it are now cheap enough to control? That question is worth fortunes. I do not want you to miss the emotional lesson here. Distressed debt requires a mindset almost nobody practices voluntarily. You have to be willing to look at something the market has declared dead and separate the corpse from the organs. You have to ask whether the structure is broken or whether the claim is simply mispriced, because the crowd cannot emotionally tolerate ambiguity. That is a hard habit to build. But once you build it, you stop being seduced by the first layer of narrative. Now let us move to the third asset, and here we leave the courtroom of bankruptcy and go to something much older, much quieter, and much more enduring, productive farmland. I want to be very careful with this one because people either romanticize it or dismiss it. It is neither a pastoral fantasy nor some mystical bunker asset. It is a productive claim on caloric necessity. That is the third mechanism. I call it the calorie floor. A society can postpone vacations. It can postpone software upgrades. It can postpone hiring. It can postpone the purchase of luxury handbags and new cars and expensive cocktails. It cannot postpone calories forever. That simple fact gives productive agricultural land a floor that many financial assets do not possess. The form of return changes by jurisdiction and by crop and by management quality. But the principle is ancient. Land that feeds people is linked to a demand stream deeper than fashion, deeper than policy, and in many cases deeper than the monetary regime itself. You can print currency. You cannot print fertile soil. You can manipulate rates. You cannot negotiate with the biological requirement to eat. This is one reason serious families and serious institutions accumulate farmland quietly over time, especially when they are thinking in generations rather than quarters. They are not just buying dirt. They are buying productive capacity anchored to a human constant. Now, not all land is equal. That matters. Decorative acreage is not the same as productive acreage. Land dependent on fragile local economics is not the same as land connected to export demand or to crops with durable economics. The wealthy understand this distinction and act accordingly. That is why I say caloric necessity is the floor, not the whole thesis. The crowd hears farmland and imagines rustic safety. The skilled buyer hears farmland and asks about water, yields, crop economics, replacement cost, jurisdiction, operating risk, transport, and who ultimately buys the output. That discipline matters, but the big idea is simple. During periods when paper claims are being repriced and monetary promises are under stress, productive land often behaves less like a speculative asset and more like a living utility. Now look at what this does psychologically inside a crash. The owner of farmland is not staring at a stock ticker wondering whether sentiment improved at noon. He is looking at a productive system. He is asking whether the land continues to produce, whether the economics remain sound, and whether the long arc of food demand remains intact. That is a different emotional experience from owning overvalued paper. It is slower. It is less theatrical. It is also one reason generational capital survives. Real wealth often hides inside assets that do not need applause. The fourth asset is one many people misunderstand even more badly than farmland: blue chip fine art and other truly scarce cultural assets. I can already hear the objection. Art is for collectors. Art is for vanity. Art is for people who wear soft shoes and say obvious things in auction rooms. There is some truth in that caricature. Human beings love wrapping money in status, but that is not the core reason serious capital moves here before trouble. That is the fourth mechanism. I call it the scarcity vault. When a central bank expands money supply, when currencies weaken, when paper promises multiply faster than real things, truly scarce assets with no possibility of mass reproduction become repositories for wealth preservation. That does not make every painting a good investment any more than every stock certificate is a good business, but it explains why the highest tier of scarce cultural assets behaves differently from the way the public imagines. The public sees beauty and taste. Serious capital sees fixed supply plus elite demand plus low correlation. There are only so many museum grade works by the few artists the world has already agreed matter. The dead do not increase output. The supply curve is brutal. When wealth wants shelter from paper dilution, Some portion of it naturally seeks objects that cannot be manufactured by policy. And there is another layer the public misses. The richest buyers do not always buy through public auctions where the whole world can watch the hammer fall and talk about a record price. They often buy quietly, privately, on negotiated terms, especially when another wealthy holder needs liquidity elsewhere and prefers discretion to spectacle. That privacy is not incidental, it is strategic. Public markets tell the crowd what something is worth today. Private treaty transactions often tell the informed what the powerful are willing to pay before the crowd notices the pattern. I do not want you to conclude from this that you should run out and become an art speculator. That would miss the point entirely. The point is structural. Scarcity that cannot be printed has a role during monetary stress. The ultra-wealthy understand that role and allocate accordingly. They hide preservation inside prestige, because prestige is socially easier to talk about than fear. That lesson travels far beyond art. Whenever you see the wealthy wrapping an asset in language about passion, heritage, or culture, it is worth asking whether some part of what they are really buying is insulation. Now we come to the fifth asset, and this is where the transfer becomes most offensive rather than defensive: essential service monopolies. Not glamorous technology, not story stocks, not the speculative darlings of the cycle. The quiet businesses nobody brags about at dinner: waste collection, storage, funeral services, pest control, water processing, medical waste, boring things, necessary things, things people continue paying for whether the economy is singing or coughing up blood. That is the fifth mechanism. I call it the toll booth. A toll booth business does not require perfect economic weather. It sits in front of a necessity and takes a small cut from an activity. People cannot stop performing. They must dispose of waste. They must store things when they downsize. They must handle death. They must keep water flowing. They must manage infestation. They must comply with rules around medical. None of that waits for GDP. This is one reason the wealthy love these businesses after downturns. During boom times, the crowd overpays for glamorous growth because glamour is psychologically intoxicating. During bust times, serious capital buys toll booths because toll booths have pricing power, recurring cash flow, and demand that does not negotiate. Notice how perfectly this fits the auction framework in a crash. The public loses appetite for boredom precisely when boredom becomes cheapest. Small operators with debt crack under pressure, routes, contracts, client lists, and equipment can be acquired at liquidation prices. The business itself did not become less necessary. The capital structure simply failed. That is where fortunes get built. The middle class experiences the downturn as shrinking balances and anxiety. The prepared acquirer experiences it as a chance to consolidate necessity. That is why I say the fifth asset is not just preservation, it is legal transfer. The person who buys toll booths after a panic is not merely defending what he has. He is setting up future cash flow streams purchased at crisis multiples. He is buying permanence from people who needed short-term survival. He is turning someone else's leverage mistake into his own long-duration annuity. That is how wealth compounds across generations. Not through clever quotes, through asymmetry. Now I want to stop and tie all of this together, because if you only hear a list of 5 assets, you will miss the actual engine running underneath all of them. The engine is not diversification. The engine is timing around forced selling. That is the phrase I want in your head. Forced selling, the wealthy do not merely buy different things. They buy different things at different moments and for different reasons. They spend the expansion phase building the one asset that gives them decisive power later. Liquidity. Then they watch for stress. When stress appears, they do not ask, "How do I feel?" They ask, Who is being forced to sell something I would love to own? That is the master behavior. Every one of these assets can be understood through that lens. Short-term government paper gives you dry powder. Distressed debt lets you buy priority claims from a broken structure. Farmland lets you buy productive necessity. Fine art lets you store value in scarcity. Essential monopolies let you acquire recurring toll booths when weaker owners crack. Different wrappers, same logic. Buy from stress, not from comfort. That is the identity flip I want for you. Most ordinary investors move through markets like tenants. They rent whatever narrative is popular that year. They rent confidence from index momentum. They rent emotional safety from consensus. They rent the idea that someone else is managing the real structure. The prepared investor becomes an owner of optionality. He no longer asks how to participate in the party more efficiently. He asks what he wants to own when the party ends and the shares are being sold. That is a different man. That man does not need to predict the exact day of the crash. He simply needs to prepare before it. Now, a reasonable person might say, "This all sounds clever, but I do not run a giant family office. I do not have access to private treaty art sales or distressed debt desks or farmland syndicates. What exactly am I supposed to do with this?" That is the right question, and my answer is this. Do not copy the surface. Copy the principles. You may not buy a bankrupt bond issue at 15 cents on the dollar, but you can absolutely learn to think in terms of priority, balance sheet strength, and who gets wiped out first when the structure breaks. You may not build a national waste, hauling empire, but you can absolutely understand why boring necessity with pricing power deserves more of your respect than fashionable dreams priced for perfection. You may never own 1,000 acres, but you can understand the deep difference between productive real assets and decorative financial claims. And above all, you can build your own version of dry powder. That alone would put you ahead of most people, because the average investor has been trained to think that full deployment equals virtue. He thinks idle cash is a confession of weakness. He believes that if his money is not climbing every minute, he is failing. That conditioning is expensive. Cash is not laziness when valuations are insane. Cash is not cowardice when cycles are late. Cash is not confusion when liquidity is drying up. Cash is deferred aggression. That phrase is worth keeping. I would rather look timid for 18 months and powerful for 18 days than the reverse. Let me give you another identity shift, because this one matters just as much. You must move from being a price watcher to being a forced seller hunter. A price watcher sees red and asks whether he should be scared. A forced seller hunter sees red and asks who is trapped. A price watcher wants reassurance. A forced seller hunter wants inventory. A price watcher consumes commentary. A forced seller hunter studies structure. This is how generational wealth is built, not by reacting fastest to headlines, but by understanding where the system creates involuntary transfer. That word involuntary is everything. Voluntary sales are ordinary commerce. Involuntary sales are the raw material of great fortunes. The middle class usually arrives late to assets because it buys confidence. It sees things going well, sees prices rising, sees the social proof, and enters when everything feels safe. The wealthy often arrive early, not because they are psychics, but because they are willing to look stupid while building position in what no one is celebrating yet. Then, when the crash comes, they do not become heroes, they become buyers, and buyers write the next ownership map. I have always believed that the most dangerous phrase in investing is not "this time is different." It is, "I'll just ride it out." Sometimes you should ride it out. Sometimes that is exactly correct. But a man who says that without understanding what the wealthy are doing before the crash, during the crash, and immediately after the crash is not making a calm decision, he is reciting a slogan. Slogans are for people who do not want to think. Wealth transfer events punish slogans. The old line that you cannot time the market is repeated so often that people stop hearing the assumptions built into it. It is good advice for investors who would otherwise turn themselves into day traders. It is not a full description of how major capital behaves. Very rich people do not time every wiggle, but they absolutely change posture when the cycle matures. They absolutely move toward liquidity. They absolutely accumulate defensive and acquisition-oriented assets before the crowd feels danger. They absolutely buy when forced selling appears. That is timing, not in the cartoon version, in the structural version, and it works. The reason the public is rarely taught this clearly is not always malice. Often it is simply that institutions design advice for the median participant, and the median participant cannot or will not execute a more demanding playbook. So, he is given a simpler religion: stay invested, stay calm. Keep contributing. It is not wrong. It is just not the whole map. I would rather you have the whole map, even if you use only part of it. Now let me give you a protocol, because unless ideas become behavior, they are just entertainment. First, calculate your real liquidity. Not your theoretical wealth. Your actual liquidity. What could you deploy in a panic without selling core holdings at bad prices? That number tells you whether you are entering the next auction as a buyer or as a spectator. Second, classify your assets by fragility. Which things in your life and portfolio depend on stable credit, stable employment, stable confidence, and stable valuations? Which things continue producing value even when confidence evaporates? This exercise alone will change the way you see risk. Third, study necessity. If you want durable wealth, ask which products and services people cannot cancel, even when they are frightened. That question is more valuable than most market forecasts. Fourth, train yourself to think in claims, not just stories. Who is senior? Who gets paid first? Who gets wiped out? Where is the priority? This will keep you from confusing glamour with security. Fifth, stop treating boredom as disqualification. The wealthy often buy what feels too dull to brag about. That is one reason they keep owning things after the boasters are wiped out. Finally, create one hard rule for yourself. When the next real markdown comes, you will not make your first decision in the middle of the panic. You will decide in advance what you want to buy if it gets cheap enough. You will create your shopping list before the fire sale. That one habit separates adults from victims. If you only remember one sentence from what I have said, let it be this: a crash is an auction. Once you really believe that, you stop asking how to survive the room and start preparing to bid in it. That is how the rich think. That is how ownership changes hands, and that is how a downturn that terrifies most people becomes, for the patient and prepared, the most valuable shopping season of the cycle.